So you can see my screen as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I would have loved to have been, but basically due to some boring visa stuff, I'm trapped in the US right now. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak to you guys today. I'm really happy to have that opportunity. So my title is New Methods for Preparing, Imaging, and Processing cryo-EM Samples, which, I was obviously feeling very grandiose when I sent this title. I feel like I have to kind of stick to it now. So I am going to try and stick to that, but this may get a little bit crazy. And so I apologize if that is the case. So I am actually going to try and talk to you about 3 different methods today. One, which uses mass spectrometry to make EM grids, to land samples onto EM grids. I'm going to talk to you about an imaging method that we're developing, which is kind of like a software faceplate, where we change the defocus as we image to get high contrast images. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about image processing by talking about our software package system. So better get going quickly, and I'm sorry if I have to cut things short. So I'm being CCP-EM, I thought it would be good to talk about system first, some software first. System is a software package for processing cryo-EM images. It's been out for a few years now. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it, because it's been around for a while. Many people will know about that. What I do want to do is give you a kind of overview, talk a little bit about how it's different from some other packages, and give you a little bit of an example of some maybe useful methods that you can use in it. So system was originally developed in Nico Grigoriev's lab by myself, Nico, and Alexei. In recent times, Ben and Johannes have been contributing a lot to it. And so this is kind of the current team right now. One thing I really want to emphasize is that system is completely free. It's completely open source. You can always go in and look at the source code and see what is happening. This is the website if you want to download it. If you go to the website, you will get a very old version of system. The released version is very old. There is a development version that you can get from GitHub if you want to compile it yourself. That will have all the new features. But if you just want to try it out, it is kind of much easier to use this. It's much more stable. So you can try this out. And then if you want some of the newer features, sort of get into the more recent GitHub stuff. System has a complete workflow for single particle analysis and some other analyses now. You can do everything from movie correction, motion correction, to sharpening your final high resolution 3D map. And it's kind of something we spent a lot of time working on, was this graphical user interface. So there is a nice GUI to it. The idea being that you can see how your jobs are progressing. You can be very selective in what data you take forward, and basically just to give a lot of feedback. One recent addition to system is this idea of high resolution template matching. So using known structures to find with very high specificity and accuracy those structures in 2-dimensional projection images, single 2-dimensional images of cells. That's work that Bronwyn, Ben, Johannes, and Nico have been doing a lot of. And I'm not going to speak about it today. I just wanted to make you aware that this exists and you can do it from within system. So what I really want to focus on here is just some of the differences between system and other packages. This is there are a number of differences that it can be interesting to consider. So the first is that when we are selecting angles and shifts for our particles, we do so using a matched filter. And a matched filter is just essentially a correlation that you can mathematically describe to say if certain conditions are met, and those conditions are really that the noise is white and that the spectral power of your image and reference are the same, you cannot detect things better than using this matched filter approach. And so this is what we use to essentially find out which angles and which shifts match our images. And this is quite different from how other packages are doing it. And so that's something to bear in mind. We don't use maximum likelihood for our structure solution. We use it for classification, but not for the individual structure solution. If we're doing 3D classification, we use it between the classes, but not during the actual refinement. That's another important difference. Another very important thing to bear in mind is that we do not do independent half sets of our data. So nowadays, people are most familiar with the idea that you split your data into two halves at the beginning and refine those somewhat independently. And then you do all your comparisons between those two half sets. We do not do that. We align all of our data to a single reference, but we do resolution limiting. And so we will only use information up to a certain resolution when we're doing our alignments. And what that means is before that resolution, you do have essentially bias built into the system, built into the map and the Faux correlation. But after that resolution, you have no bias in either the map or the Faux correlation. So as long as your resolution is somewhat higher than this, your measured resolution is somewhat higher than your alignment resolution, it's kind of believable. It makes it very important what you set this resolution to be, and it makes it very important that you report this resolution if you use published results from system, because otherwise you cannot judge how accurate that may be. So it's an important thing to bear in mind. And finally, when we do our resolution estimations, we do not directly mask our half maps. We scale our Faux correlation by amount that we have estimated based on what we would expect for if we had masked our half maps. And in our hands, that leads to very similar to results to masking. But again, you need to bear in mind that it's being done differently to other packages. So if you see different results, that's one of the reasons why it may be. Now, one of the reasons I want to highlight all of these differences actually is that actually we have Shaw Sharers visiting us at the moment, and he's very big on Twitter, and something that I've not quite got into yet. And he showed me this tweet from, I guess, a couple of days ago, a discussion about a bacterial pili system in Matthias Wolf's lab, where they are getting better results with system than other software packages. And I'm not saying that you will always get better results with system than other software packages. What I'm saying is that it is often worth trying different software packages to see if you can get better results, particularly in the case where things are not working. And I think one advantage that the system has in this is that we are doing things quite differently from other packages. So you have an increased likelihood of getting something different, which doesn't necessarily mean better, but different. And I think it's good to have that kind of availability of different things to try. So I want to spend the rest of this sort of image processing section talking about two of the new features in system that could be directly useful as a sort of just a plucking in and grabbing them. One is the AbInitio reconstruction in system. So that is done quite differently again from other software packages. And so again, it gives you another opportunity to recover that information if it's not working for you in other ways. And then I want to talk about our tilted CTF estimation. The novel feature of this is really a correction that is performed on the experimental amplitude spectra. So in an AbInitio reconstruction, you're all familiar with the idea that you want to go from something that looks like this, a kind of ball, to something that looks hopefully a lot like the particle that you're trying to solve. And so in a sort of very simple case, this is an iterative refinement, just starting with this as the reference. But we all know that if we just put this into our normal refinement programs, this is never going to work because we get stuck in local minima. So we need ways to get out of these local minima. And in system, we have a number of different ways of doing this. But what I really want to focus on is this non-greedy alignment. And in the development version of system, you can use 2D classification information to kind of constrain your AbInitio. So one of the problems with not using a maximum likelihood approach and getting stuck in local minima is illustrated quite nicely by this example. So this pore protein has a 5-fold symmetry. And there you can see how if you are just selecting one shift, one angle for each image, if you have one of these 5 views that looks slightly better than the other, the majority of your images are going to go there because they can only go to one place, and they're going to go to the best looking place. And so what you end up with is these terrible maps that are very smeared and very directional. And that's actually illustrative of a broader problem of these. If you have maps that have better regions than others, this is something that will happen very often and lead you away from the correct answer and get you stuck in these local minima. And so the way that we overcame this, we didn't want to sort of implement maximum likelihood and things like that, is to keep with our non-maximum likelihood method, but do something we call a sloppy alignment. And it's actually very simple. What we do is we score every different global orientation. So in this diagram, each red dot here is a different orientation. And then we rank them from the best score to the worst score. And then we take a cutoff, which is essentially 15% of the top score. And anything above that, we consider. And we just randomly take one of these orientations, one of these found orientations for a given image. What that means is in the beginning, when you have essentially the wrong map, your best score and your worst score are very, very similar. There's no real differentiation between, because it all looks kind of the same and it's all kind of wrong. And then almost all of your orientations kind of end up in this section. And then you randomly select one, you're randomly selecting from a kind of pool of things, some of which will be right, some of which will be wrong. But when your model starts to converge and get more and more correct, this actually spreads out. Your worst score is much worse than your best score. And so now you only have maybe one, or in this case, because we have 5 views that are very similar, 5 views above this threshold that you end up picking. And it turns out this was incredibly powerful for us in terms of escaping these local minima and finding the correct solution. And so if you just simply turn this on, you solve this problem that I showed you before. Now you have a nice even distribution and you see from many different, you see it looks the same from all different directions, even though this is an asymmetric reconstruction. And this is kind of, as I said, indicative of this general problem of going from the incorrect model to the correct model. And so this tends to work pretty well for us. We can start with these blobs, follow this particular alignment, and end with something that looks correct the vast majority of the time, actually. So we've recently extended this to use information from 2D class averaging. So actually getting 2D class averages is much simpler than getting your 3D AbInitio. Again, you will all know that you can start this with a random blob and you will end up with nice 2D class averages. You cannot really do that for 3D. And so why then do we tend to just do these class averages, select the nice images, and then go back to these kind of images and forget all of this information? And so what we now do is we take these classifications and we make kind of faux images from them. So these are our constrained faux images where we have just taken random subsets from these class averages of 5 to 10 images. It's a tunable parameter you can change. And we make sums of them. So these sums now have considerably higher signal to noise ratio than the images that you had in the first place. And then we just run the whole process again. And this leads to much increased robustness because now we have greater signal in our images. Basically, we got this to work in the first place, then we can use that, the fact that we got this to work, to get higher SNR in our images that we're using for the AbInitio. And so this works very nicely. And so if you're having problems with AbInitio, I would recommend trying it. We're also investigating using this process to enhance 3D reconstructions themselves, but I don't have results to show on that right now. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of system is this tilted CTF correction. So if you want to take tilted data, I think this can be very useful. we're doing sort of a very old method in terms of estimating the defocus, where you just patch up your image, you work out individual defoci for each part of the image, and then try and fit a plane to that, essentially. But you'll find that when you take tilted images, you tend to get very bad experimental power spectra. You see very few rings because of the changing defocus across the image, or the fact that you have to take a very small area. But it turns out that a change in defocus is very similar to a change in magnification. So if you ignore spherical aberration, you can basically either change the defocus or change the magnification and change the contrast transfer function in the same way. And so what we now do is we scale our image along the tilt axis based on the defocus change that you would expect. And what that does is basically make all of the rings line up, so that when you calculate your experimental power spectrum, even from a tilted image, you can see many, many more tone rings. So you go from an image that looks like this to an image that looks like this, and you can suddenly see now many more rings. And this has a couple of advantages. The first is that you can estimate your average defocus actually with much better accuracy, because now you have all these rings to fit to for your average defocus. And the other is that you can actually sort your images by their fit resolution much better. Before, even good and bad images would have all looked bad like this, but now the good and bad images will actually differ in how many rings you can see. So this can be illustrated in one dimension as well. This is basically what I just showed you. The green is the experimental amplitude spectra without correction. You get bad amplitude spectra and you get a bad fit resolution. But if you do this correction, suddenly now you get a much better amplitude spectra, you get a much better quality of fit, and you can start to sort your images by that and pick the very best images that you have. Okay, that was my image processing section. Now I'm going to go to my grid preparation section. So this is work that I've been doing in collaboration with Josh Kuhn. So Josh Kuhn runs a national mass spectrometry facility here in UW-Madison. And these guys also have been working on the project. Mike is a guy who likes to build mass spectrometers, and Kenny and Austin have done a lot of the work that I'm going to show you. So this is something that I'm sure you've talked about a lot, and including today, and that is, what does an ideal grid look like when you're making a grid? And I guess a lot of people would say this looks like an ideal grid, where you have very, very thin ice, nice orientations. Your ice is basically as thin as your particle. Probably more realistically, we have cases that are more like this, where you have thicker ice than your particle, and this ice is actually taking away a lot of your signal. So everybody knows that if you have very thick ice, you're going to lose signal, you're going to have worse images. And also, everybody knows that you often get preferential orientation by sticking to the air-water interface. So what if we could make a grid that looks more like this? So now our particles are not actually embedded in the ice, in a full ice layer. They kind of have these little jackets of ice around them. And this is something that would be very hard to make conventionally, but maybe you could make by a native mass spectrometry, where you can essentially you can electrospray these particles, run them through a mass spec with a small solvent shell, land them on a cold grid, and end up with a grid like this. And so this is our ultimate aim, and I think this would have amazingly good contrast, and quite possibly would not suffer from things like beam-induced motion, and maybe you'll get better orientations. This is something that we have not done. Unfortunately, I'm not going to tell you that we've done this today, but it's something that we're very much working on. Actually, when we started doing this, it wasn't really clear whether particles survive, how well particles survive native mass spectrometry, whether they get damaged very much at all. And so the first thing we decided to do was to try and investigate this using negative stain, room temperature negative stain grids. It's kind of much simpler. And so Mike built this modified mass spectrometer where we can electrospray our particles, we can take them through, we can mass filter them still, we can essentially purify the sample within the mass spectrometer. And then we can either send it to an analyzer and get your usual spectra and analyze what you're seeing, or you can flip it the other way and land it onto EM grids. And so the first thing we tried was to take these particles of cryo-EM, put them through the mass spec, land them on EM grids, and negative stain them. And we got images that look like this. So these images look very bad, actually. The cryo-EM was clearly dying and being smushed up, and bad things were happening. And that makes quite a lot of sense, actually, if you think about it, because these things are sitting here in a vacuum and gradually particles are kind of landing and building up. They spend a considerable amount of time, many, many minutes, sitting in this vacuum. They're going to completely dehydrate. They're going to be broken, essentially. And this is something that people have known for many, many years. People who do rotary shadowing, for example, they will include glycerol in their sample so that the glycerol acts as a protection from this vacuum effect. And so what we did was simply take a very thin coat of glycerol onto the grid before we landed the particles onto it, and land the particles directly onto that, then do our negative staining. And it turns out that's working very well. You probably can't see actually in these images, but we've tried it with a number of different samples, even more now. And without this protective layer, you just get smushed. They might have the vague shape of the particle, but they clearly don't have any detail in them. Whereas if you have this matrix, you get much nicer particles that look very much like conventionally prepared negative stain images. So this is cryo-EM that has been landed through the mass spec, mass selected and landed through a mass spec onto an EM grid and then stained. And you can see that these look pretty good, actually. They look largely intact, at least to the resolution that you can see with the negative stain. And we have done reconstructions of these. So this is 2D class averages from the data I just showed you. You can make reconstructions that look a lot like cryo-EM. The gray structure here is the landed through the mass spec structure. The yellow structure is the conventionally stained structure. And they're very, very similar. There are some differences that we can see. It's not clear if those are real differences or just kind of differences due to the fact these are different data sets. And also, obviously, we're limited to negative stain resolution here. So it's not clear if at very high resolution, things are surviving quite as well. But really, this is a great first step for us. This paper actually came out last week, if you want to go and read it. But the ultimate aim for us now is to move to making cryogrids, so we get these high resolution structures using a very similar technique. Whew, deep breath. I think I have a couple more minutes. And again, I'm sorry this is a bit crazy. But my final one is an imaging method. So then I will have not have lied, and I've stayed true to my title. And so this is work that's done by a graduate student in my lab, Gan Lee. And what we essentially wondered was, can we make a faceplate for cryo-EM, that a faceplate-like thing for cryo-EM that doesn't rely on actually having a faceplate? So faceplates make really nice images. They have really nice low resolution contrast. This is images from Rado's Volta faceplate. But they have a number of problems, right, that I think people are now very, very aware of. The main one probably is that you lose an awful lot of electrons to this faceplate layer, up to 20%, maybe a little less. And also faceplates are kind of difficult to work with and align and things like that. So I think these days, even though you get this nice low resolution contrast, the fact that you're losing 20% of your other signal, people have kind of switched to not using faceplates for a single particle imaging. And so we thought, can we sort of come up with something that doesn't have this signal loss, but has very good low resolution contrast that should ultimately help, at least with difficult cryo-EM samples. Now, we all know that you can get very good contrast by defocusing the microscope a lot. And people don't tend to do this. This has become slightly more controversial in recent years with some evidence that you should be able to defocus a lot and get nice reconstructions. In my hands, that doesn't tend to work very well, and I think in other people's hands also. But even if you can, you have a number of other disadvantages, such as the fact that you can only use a little bit of your image because the particles at the edge have had information delocalized out of the frame. Actually, people tend to take images much more like this, where you're very close to focus. And for things like high resolution apopheratin, you'll find it's much more common to take close to focus images. And so we essentially thought, why can't you combine this and start off taking your movie very close to focus, get these nice images that people like to take, and then as the movie progresses, change your defocus so that you can get more and more low resolution contrast. And this is a movie which I realize probably is not transferring well across Zoom, but essentially this is a movie where we're changing the defocus through the exposure. You can see it start very close to focus and then end up very far from focus. And you get much more contrast at the end than you do at the beginning. And so we sort of refined this process now. We've developed software that sits and runs on the microscope PC, and it allows us to change the defocus in whatever way we want very quickly and very reproducibly, actually. And it turns out there's a few problems that we've had to consider. One of which is when you change the defocus in this way, we cannot line it up to the different frames. And so there will always be some defocus change within the frame, and that leads to some signal loss. So the more you change the defocus, the more you will lose signal. But actually, it turns out that's not too much of a problem for us, because we also know that as you increase your dose, as your movie frame carries on, you're losing a lot of your high resolution information anyway due to radiation damage. And so what we can do is we can essentially take the measurements of radiation damage and defocus signal loss and combine them to something we call a critical defocus change, where we can estimate what is the maximum we can change our defocus for a given signal loss. So in this case, this is a 1% signal loss, and over the course of 100 electrons per angstrom squared, actually we can get up to 40 micron defocus. And that is far higher than we want to do. We typically only go up to about 10 microns defocus. And so our signal loss should be considerably less than 1%, actually. We've measured this over many, many images on high signal images, and we can see that it's very reproducible. So every time we run this sweep, it basically changes the defocus in the same way. Of course, our starting defocus is different, so we still have to estimate that from the actual movies. But we can do that by fitting this curve, using this curve as a restraint. And actually something that's quite nice is that we can start very close to focus and still fit that defocus very accurately, because we can use this regime in the middle and the end as a restraint where we have lots of nice tone rings to do that fitting. I'm going to very quickly mention that there are some distortions that we have to take into account that we've now kind of measured and calibrated quite well. They're linear, so it's actually very easy. They're linear with the focus change. But there's some slight rotations over sort of 10 to 12 micron defocus. You get a very, very small rotation and a very, very small change in magnification, but we can correct for these very well now. So this is what a defocus sweep image of apopheratin looks like. This is sort of the stage we're currently at. So this sweep started at 0.4 micron defocus, and it ended at about 7 micron defocus. And then we can combine all of those frames together to make this single image where we've kind of CTF corrected it, actually, because each frame has a different CTF. You end up with an image that has, apart from at the very, very low resolutions, almost no CTF. And to me, these images look very, very much like a faceplate image, but without the signal loss. And so this is where we're at right now, is working with apopheratin. We have reconstructions where we've compared with and without, and they're very, very similar. In theory, the sweep one is slightly better, but it's probably not, completely believable that it's better. Really, the aim of this for me was to show that it was not significantly worse, actually. And that the defocus sweeping was actually not killing the high resolution information, at least to where we can measure it. The goal of this is not to solve apoferritin, it's to solve harder things such as heterogeneous things or smaller things. So this was a great result for us. And now we're going on and we're going to try and try this out on a number of much harder samples. Okay, I'm sorry I went a little bit over, but thank you all for your time. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Tim, for a very clear and interesting talk, and well done on sticking with your title. Any questions?
Hi, thank you, Tim. That was really cool. I just had just a thought about your prepping the grids by the mass spec method. Just while you're getting your vitrification sorted, have you thought about maybe just doing cryo-negative staining, which would be very similar to, you know, preparing for negative stain, and then you can just plunge into liquid nitrogen. I don't think it even needs liquid ethane, and then you could get to. You wouldn't be limited by the grain size then. It'd be about 10 angstroms, which I guess would give you a bit more information about if, you know, the cryo-EM is happy, say, just as a kind of stopgap to, you know, sorting out the full-on vitrification, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, and we haven't done it, but it's a very good idea. And we are, we sort of have this intermediate phase. This is kind of like an intermediate phase, right? Where you're trying to get to the cryo, but you also want to extend what you've already got. So we're trying things along that line where you would kind of keep the glycerol matrix is clearly a very bad thing to have when you want to do real cryo, but we're trying to sort of get an intermediate stage of that. And the cryo-negative staining is actually a really good idea. And so maybe we should try that. Yeah, thank you.